He thought his badge made him untouchable, a police officer feared by the town, abusing his power, humiliating anyone who dared stand in his way. But the day he mocked the wrong woman, everything changed. Because she wasn't just anyone. She was the attorney who would bring his entire empire of arrogance crashing down in court. What happened next shocked everyone. Power has a way of revealing who someone truly is. For Officer Mark Reynolds, his badge was never just a symbol of law and order. It had become his weapon of choice. Mark was once celebrated in his small town for bravery and dedication. His early years on the force were filled with admiration. People trusted him, children waved when he drove by, and shopkeepers often thanked him for keeping their businesses safe. But as time passed, respect slowly transformed into something darker: fear. The badge that should have reminded him of duty instead inflated his ego. He began walking with a swagger, shoulders back, chin high, as though the rules of society didn't apply to him. Parking tickets? He never worried about them. Speeding on the highway? He didn't even slow down. Whenever someone dared to question him, all it took was one flash of his badge and a cold smirk. People quickly backed down, and the more they did, the more untouchable he felt. It was in this state of arrogance that Mark entered a local diner one quiet evening. The place was warm and bustling with chatter, the smell of fresh coffee and fried food filling the air. At one booth sat a woman alone, her posture graceful yet strong. She was dressed simply but sharply, her hair neatly tied back. She had a stack of documents spread out before her, a pen in hand, her eyes moving with quiet determination. Her name was Jessica Carter, a young attorney new to town. She had only been living there for a few weeks, but already people whispered about her skills in the courtroom. Some admired her. Others felt threatened by her confidence. Mark noticed her immediately. Something about the way she carried herself unsettled him. She didn't look away when their eyes met. She held his gaze calmly, as if she saw right through the arrogance he wore like a mask. Just then, the waitress, nervous and flustered, accidentally tipped a coffee pot too far, spilling a few drops near Jessica's documents. Gasps came from the nearby tables, but Jessica simply moved her papers unfazed and gave the waitress a reassuring smile. Mark, however, saw an opportunity. Instead of offering help, he leaned back in his chair and laughed loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "Careful there. Some people just don't belong in nice places like this." His words cut through the chatter of the diner like a blade. Conversation stopped. Forks froze midair. The room grew quiet, all eyes turning toward Jessica. The waitress looked horrified. A few customers glanced down at their plates, uncomfortable but unwilling to interfere. Everyone knew Mark Reynolds, and everyone knew better than to challenge him, but Jessica wasn't everyone. She slowly placed her pen on the table, straightened her back, and locked eyes with him again. There was no anger in her gaze, only calm conviction. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, carrying across the silent diner. "One day, officer, you'll regret thinking your badge makes you untouchable." Her words weren't shouted, but they carried more weight than any outburst could. It was the kind of statement that stayed with you, haunting in its certainty. Mark smirked, trying to brush off the sting of her words. "Is that a threat?" He sneered, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Jessica simply smiled, gathered her papers, and returned to her reading as if nothing more needed to be said. The waitress quietly thanked her for not making a scene, while the rest of the diner cautiously resumed eating. But for Mark, the silence felt heavier than before. For the first time in a long while, someone had looked him in the eye and refused to bow down. As he left the diner later that evening, badge gleaming on his chest, Mark told himself she was just another outsider who didn't understand how things worked in his town. But deep down, something about her words clung to him, like a storm cloud just beginning to form on the horizon. Little did he know, that storm was coming for him, and Jessica Carter was the one leading it. Weeks slipped by, and with every passing day, Mark Reynolds' arrogance seemed to grow heavier, like a shadow stretching across the town. The badge that once symbolized honor had become his shield for corruption. He strutted through the streets with unchecked power, handing out tickets where none were deserved, pulling people over just to remind them who was in charge, and intimidating small business owners until they offered him free meals. The community whispered behind his back. At barbershops, grocery lines, and church pews, people traded stories of his abuses. But when his name came up, voices dropped to a hush. No one wanted to be the next target of Officer Reynolds' wrath. To most, it felt like he was untouchable, but not to Jessica Carter. She had seen men like him before, men who mistook authority for a crown, men who believed fear was the same thing as respect. Unlike the townspeople, Jessica didn't avoid him. She watched, listened, and quietly took notes. Every story she heard, every incident she witnessed went into her growing file of evidence. And then, one evening, Mark pushed things too far. Jessica had just finished a long day at the courthouse. The sun had set. The streets glowed under dim lamplight, and she was driving home with the faint hum of the radio filling her car. Out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. With a sigh, Jessica pulled over to the side of the road. She knew who it was before he even stepped out. Mark approached her car with heavy footsteps, his flashlight shining unnecessarily into her face. "License and registration," he barked. Jessica kept her voice calm, her movements deliberate. She rolled down the window and asked, "What's the reason for the stop, officer?" Mark leaned against her car, his grin spreading wide like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Reason? I don't need a reason. I'm the reason." His words dripped with arrogance, as if the law itself bent to his will. Without hesitation, he pulled out his ticket pad and scribbled something down, the pen scratching furiously against the paper. He tore off the slip and shoved it toward her. "Faulty taillight. Pay the fine or fight it in court, you'll lose either way." Jessica glanced at the paper. She knew perfectly well that her taillights were working. This was nothing but a fabricated charge, an abuse of authority. Most people would have argued, cursed, or even pleaded in this moment. That's what Mark expected, but instead, Jessica did something far more dangerous. She took the ticket gently, as if it were a gift, and looked him straight in the eye. "Thank you, officer." Then she drove away without another word. The silence rattled him. As he watched her taillights fade into the distance, unease stirred in his chest. He told himself she was just another arrogant lawyer who thought she was above the law. But deep down, her calmness unsettled him more than anger ever could. She wasn't scared, she wasn't defeated, and that meant she was planning something. What Mark didn't realize was that Jessica had been planning for weeks. She had already collected statements from shopkeepers who had been threatened. She had photos of him parked illegally, eating meals he never paid for. She had even spoken to other drivers who'd received suspicious tickets. Jessica wasn't just an attorney. She was a strategist. She understood that taking down a man like Mark wasn't about reacting in the moment. It was about building a case so airtight, so undeniable, that not even his badge could shield him. That ticket he had proudly written, it wasn't a punishment for her. It was the final piece of evidence she needed. Mark had just given her the key to his downfall, and he didn't even know it. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as the case of State versus Reynolds began. Citizens filled the benches, curious to see whether the infamous officer's power would finally be tested. Some had been victims of his intimidation. Others had simply heard the stories. But one thing was certain. Everyone wanted to see justice play out. Mark Reynolds strutted into the courtroom with the same swagger he carried on the streets. His badge gleamed proudly on his chest, polished to perfection as if it alone would sway the judge and jury. He flashed a confident smile at a few onlookers, convinced this would be yet another easy win. When the bailiff called the case, Jessica Carter rose from her chair at the defense table. She wore a tailored navy suit, her posture calm but commanding. She didn't need to announce her presence. The room already seemed to bend toward her quiet confidence. Mark's smirk faltered slightly when he saw her, but he quickly covered it with a scoff. The prosecution opened first, painting Mark as a loyal officer who had only acted to keep order. They argued that the store owner had been aggressive, refusing to comply with reasonable demands. But when it was Jessica's turn, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. She approached the witness stand where Mark now sat, adjusting his tie nervously. Her voice was smooth, deliberate. "Officer Reynolds," she began. "You've served in this community for many years, correct?" Mark puffed out his chest. "That's right. I've dedicated my career to protecting these streets." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "And in that time, would you say you've written your fair share of citations?" Mark smirked. "Of course. It's part of the job." Jessica leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on his. Is it also part of the job to have over 50 of those citations dismissed by the court in just 2 months? The question landed like a hammer. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Mark's jaw tightened. Those were procedural errors, he said quickly. Technicalities. Nothing more. Procedural errors? Jessica repeated, her tone razor sharp. So 50 times in 60 days you accidentally filed incorrect charges? Against ordinary citizens, many of whom reported feeling intimidated by you? Mark shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar. Jessica didn't let up. She lifted a sheet of paper. Let's move on. On June 3rd, my client, Mr. Patel, alleges you demanded free merchandise from his store. When he refused, you told him, quote, "You'll regret this. Do you deny saying that?" Mark's face flushed red. "Objection!" he barked. "This is hearsay." The judge raised a hand calmly. Overruled. "Answer the question, officer." Mark's mouth opened, then closed. He muttered, "I don't recall." Jessica raised her eyebrows. "You don't recall? Perhaps this video will refresh your memory." She turned toward the screen as a recording played. The grainy footage from the store's security camera showed Mark leaning across the counter, pointing at Mr. Patel, and uttering the very words. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Jessica allowed the silence to linger, then spoke softly but firmly. "So, Officer Reynolds, do you still not recall?" Mark's bravado was crumbling. His confident grin was gone, replaced by a sheen of sweat across his forehead. Jessica pressed on, her voice steady. "Over the past few months, multiple citizens have filed complaints about your behavior. Businesses intimidated. Tickets fabricated. Citizens harassed. You walked through this town believing your badge made you untouchable." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But tell me, officer, who protects the people from you?" The question hung heavy in the air. The gallery sat in stunned silence. Even the judge leaned forward, his expression grave. Mark tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The evidence was undeniable. Witness testimonies, official records, and video proof all painted the same picture. A man who had abused his power and believed he could never be held accountable. Jessica stepped back from the stand, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "Your Honor, the badge is supposed to be a symbol of service, but when it becomes a weapon of arrogance, it is the duty of this court to act. No one, no matter their title, is above the law." For the first time in his career, Mark Reynolds realized the truth. His badge wasn't a shield anymore. It was the very evidence of his downfall. The courtroom had grown tense, every eye fixed on the once arrogant officer now cornered by the very justice he had mocked for years. Mark Reynolds, who used to strut through town with his badge as a weapon, now sat slouched in the witness chair, his bravado shattered. The weight of the evidence pressed on him like iron chains. Jessica Carter, calm as ever, walked back to her table, sliding one last piece of paper across it. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to present one final document." The judge motioned for her to proceed. Jessica turned to face the jury, holding up the ticket Mark had written weeks earlier, the one he had handed her with smug pride, believing she would cower like everyone else. "This citation," she began, "was issued to me personally. It alleged that I failed to stop at a red light. But the city's traffic cameras show otherwise. Not only was I fully compliant with traffic laws, but the timing of this ticket matches exactly with when I began collecting evidence against Officer Reynolds." The jury stirred, whispering among themselves. The implication was clear. Mark hadn't written that ticket as a matter of duty. He had written it to intimidate someone he thought couldn't fight back. Jessica's voice grew sharper, slicing through the air. "This proves a disturbing pattern. Officer Reynolds didn't just target citizens at random. He targeted those who dared stand up to him. He thought his badge gave him the right to bend the truth, to write lies on official documents, and to silence people with fear." The judge leaned forward, his tone heavy with disapproval. "Officer Reynolds, do you deny this ticket was fraudulent?" Mark's mouth opened, but no words came. His shoulders slumped, his face pale. For the first time in his career, he couldn't talk his way out. His silence spoke louder than any excuse. The gavel struck once. The judge's voice thundered. "This court finds Officer Mark Reynolds guilty of misconduct, abuse of power, and filing false citations. You are hereby stripped of your position and referred for immediate disciplinary action." The gallery erupted in murmurs, some gasps of shock, others sighs of relief. Victims of Mark's intimidation exchanged glances of vindication. The once untouchable officer had finally been brought low. Jessica sat down, her composure intact, though inside she felt the weight of victory. She hadn't just won a case, she had exposed a man who had long hidden behind authority. The people watching that day would remember it forever. Mark lowered his head into his hands. The badge that once gave him power now lay tarnished in the eyes of the community. He thought it made him untouchable, but now it was the very proof of his downfall. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing the moment. His name would no longer be remembered for heroism, but for disgrace. Jessica stood once more, addressing the court with quiet dignity. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not just about one man abusing power. It's about the reminder that authority without accountability is dangerous. No one, not even an officer, is above the law. And today, justice has spoken. The room fell silent. Then, as the gavel struck again to close the session, a wave of applause broke out in the gallery. Citizens who had once been too afraid to speak now stood taller, their faith in justice restored. Mark Reynolds was escorted out of the courtroom, no longer the intimidating figure who believed he could do as he pleased. His future was uncertain, his reputation ruined, and his career over. Jessica, meanwhile, packed her documents into her briefcase with calm satisfaction. She didn't gloat or smirk, she didn't need to. Her victory was already written in the hearts of the people who had watched the trial unfold. As she stepped outside into the bright sunlight, a reporter called out, "Ms. Carter, how does it feel to bring down the untouchable?" Jessica paused, then smiled faintly. It wasn't about bringing someone down. It was about lifting the truth up. Her words echoed through the crowd, sealing the story of the day. And so the tale of Officer Mark Reynolds ended not with the flash of a badge, but with the sound of justice served, proof that arrogance, no matter how strong, will always crumble under the weight of truth. When the gavel struck for the final time, the courtroom erupted into a storm of voices. Reporters leapt from their seats, cameras flashed, and microphones swarmed toward Jessica Carter. She, however, remained calm amidst the chaos, her composure unshaken. One reporter shouted, "Ms. Carter, how does it feel to defeat an officer who thought he was untouchable?" Another asked, "Do you think justice has finally been served?" Jessica raised her hand slightly, signaling for quiet. Her voice, steady yet powerful, carried through the courthouse steps. No one is above the law. A badge is not a shield for arrogance, it is a symbol of service and responsibility. If we allow pride and abuse to go unchecked, justice itself crumbles. And when justice fails, we all pay the price. Her words cut through the frenzy like a blade of truth. Even those who had come seeking only headlines paused to listen. It wasn't just a statement for the press, it was a lesson for the entire community. Across the courthouse lawn, people gathered, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Parents nudged their children, telling them to remember this day. Business owners nodded in relief, knowing they could finally breathe without fear of being intimidated. Victims of Mark's corruption stood taller, finally vindicated. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds emerged from the side exit of the courthouse under heavy escort. But this time there was no applause, no respect, no deference. His once commanding stride was gone, replaced with slow, defeated steps. His head hung low, his badge removed, his career in ruins. For years he had lived like a man untouchable, towering over his community with intimidation and arrogance. Now he was just another man stripped of power, left to face the wreckage he had created. The irony was undeniable. The very badge he flaunted as a weapon had become the evidence of his downfall. It was no longer a mark of honor, but a reminder of everything he had lost: his job, his reputation, and the respect of the people he once ruled with fear. Jessica walked past the crowd, her briefcase in hand, head held high. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile triumphantly. Victory for her wasn't about humiliation. It was about truth. She understood that justice wasn't about crushing an opponent, but about restoring balance to a community that had been broken by abuse. A woman from the crowd stepped forward, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you for standing up when none of us could." Jessica gave her a gentle nod. "It wasn't just me," she said softly. "It was all of us. The truth only wins when people are brave enough to speak it." The cameras caught every word, every expression, every quiet moment of dignity. For the town, Jessica had become more than just an attorney. She was a symbol of resilience and accountability. Her courage reminded everyone that even the most powerful could be brought down when they crossed the line. Later that evening, as the courthouse steps grew empty, the story spread beyond the town. Newspapers ran headlines about the arrogant officer who thought he was untouchable and the young attorney who exposed him. Social media lit up with clips of Jessica's closing words, inspiring conversations about justice, responsibility, and the dangers of unchecked authority. Mark, alone in his apartment that night, finally faced the truth he had spent years avoiding. He had worn his badge like armor, but he had forgotten what it truly meant. By letting arrogance and entitlement guide him, he had destroyed everything he once had. Power without integrity, he realized too late, was nothing but emptiness. Jessica, on the other hand, ended her day with quiet satisfaction. She didn't see herself as a hero, only as someone who had done what was right. Yet the community now looked to her as proof that courage could topple even the most intimidating walls of corruption. The lesson was carved into the memory of everyone who had witnessed it. Power is fragile when it lacks integrity, and authority means nothing when divorced from responsibility. Those who misuse their positions may rise quickly, but their fall is inevitable, and sooner or later they will meet someone strong enough to hold them accountable. That day, Jessica Carter proved that justice, though often delayed, is never defeated. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories your way. And remember, every story carries a lesson worth sharing. See you in the next one.